Oh, I know.
Okay, morning everyone. It's 9:30, so it's time to resume the hearing session as part of the examination of the controls local plan. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Can everyone hear me okay at the back? No? Talk a bit louder? Yeah? Okay. If at any stage anybody can't hear me, please let me know. Wave a hand. Let me know. Throw something at me. Do something to get my attention. Well, welcome back everybody. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw. I'm the Inspector Sponsor Secretary of State to hold the examination. Welcome for those of you who haven't attended any previous sessions. Welcome back to those of you who attended yesterday or previously. The Programme Officer, Charlotte Nancy, is not here this week. As for yesterday, Hannah, who's at the back, is stepping in for Charlotte. If anybody has any questions regarding statements or anything like that, please do continue to use the email address. So the Bank Solutions email address, both Charlotte and Hannah can pick both those emails up. So please do continue to use that. If you have any questions with regard to today, seating arrangements, etc., start finish times, anything to do with today, then feel free to grab Hannah. She'll be around throughout the day. I'll just hand over to Hannah very quickly just to go through a couple of brief fire and emergency procedures.
I'm going to read the fire drill evacuation procedure. So in the event of a fire alarm ringing continuously, you must immediately evacuate the building at all pace. Officers will escort you by the most direct available route. No one is to use the lift. We will make our way to the fire assembly point by the entrance to the town hall yard car park on Wanton Way. Once outside, a check will be made to ensure everyone has safely left and no one is to re-enter the building until advised that it is safe to do so. On Fridays at 2 PM, the fire alarm will ring briefly to test the system. This is not a fire drill unless the bell continues to ring continuously.
Thank you very much. So moving on with the examination, yesterday we talked about housing needs and employment needs. And we started to touch upon issues surrounding the strategy, which is the main topic for today, really. So as this examination goes forward, we start with the big strategic issues, we sort of take everything in bite-sized chunks, and we move forward and get more and more into the detail. We talked about the numbers yesterday, and the numbers of housing, and the number of hectares of employment land. So today we'll take that forward and start to really consider the strategy and where the council has proposed to meet, in particular, its housing needs. As we've done on previous days, we will, for the purpose of this session, go through the matters, issues and questions document. So probably start with myself asking questions of the local authority. If people have made representations on the points that we're discussing, they're more than happy for people to participate in that discussion and put their points across just by raising their name plate in the end. My eyesight's not that good, and I don't know all of you just yet, so if there's a lot of pointing, please excuse that. It's just I can't see past probably Mr. Bond is probably the test of mine.
And patience.
So we'll continue in that vein really. What I would just say is, please do, when making points, stick to the representations that you've made. Also, the hearings are an opportunity to put your points across and make your representations, but it's not about making new points. It's not about introducing new points. And as before, it's really a structured discussion. There's no presentation of evidence, there's no cross-examination of witnesses or anything like that. So it really is sort of round-table discussion. And please do feel free to get involved in the discussion. And at the end of the day, you think, well, I've sat here with the inspectors, asked lots of questions, but not asked things about what I want to talk about. Again, let me know. Please let me know. This is an opportunity to put your points across, so please do let me know. We've got on the agenda today essentially all day to talk about the issues today, so I don't think we'll request the time. But I want to say is that I have read obviously the representations that have been made. I've read the hearing statements that have been submitted, so please don't feel free that you have to repeat the representations or hearing statements that you've made. I can take those as read, but listen, please do feel free to get involved in the discussion and the debate. We'll aim to break for lunch around 1 o'clock, but as I said, we've got all day, so we'll see how we do with that. There's a natural break in the issues. And again, we'll have a break mid-morning. We started slightly early today, so we'll have a break like 11 o'clock or so. And we'll have a break this afternoon as well. But again, if people would like to say something but are constrained by time, they need to be somewhere at a certain time, or they have to leave, etc. Again, please just do shout it really. Any questions, observations, housekeeping matters arising before we get going? No. That must signal the start then. Okay, so spatial strategy. We talked a little bit about this when we went through the sustainability appraisal back when we first met. But we'll touch upon that as well, and we'll go through some of the issues. The first issue, which was a question I asked, and the representatives had also made the point, as to whether or not the submitted plan contains a settlement hierarchy, either in the same way as the adopted strategy does, or in the same way as we see in other local plans. So the sort of typical local plan that you see, settlement hierarchy, main town, secondary towns, villages, etc., and then the plan sort of works on from that. So does this plan do that? And if not, why not?
Thanks, happy to take that. Yes, and certainly many plans do that. Not all, I'd say, but and certainly more recently, I've sort of noticed it more through examinations. It just sort of, I think that the key point that the Borough Council would look to make is that where you have a settlement hierarchy, it's generally based on the availability of services, facilities, and like other authorities, and the purpose of the hierarchy is really is to provide information about that to feed into the development of your strategy. And we set out at a very early stage in the process, doing that through the settlement role and function study. I think one of the first things that the Borough Council did, and it's periodically updated, most recently CD 3133. It's used particularly in the sustainability appraisal process, and as we say in the statement, it's not the sole determinant. That's true of all authorities, I'm sure, but it certainly influences the strategy, as do of course other things like infrastructure, accessibility, environmental context. And I'll refer to sort of things like flood risk area and greenbelt, land availability, of course, jobs and the like. So I think the council has set out a settlement hierarchy in its background paper. You'll have seen that. In terms of the actual, within the plan itself, the strategy is essentially policy STR1. And that essentially sets out the the development strategy, distribution of development. And within that, that promotes brownfield land, focus on settlements with limits to build development. And then point I wanted to highlight was at point 3, it provides for the growth assessments having regard to their role and function, constraints and opportunities, together with the development of the 2 strategic sites, which we're familiar with, Paddockwood and Tudor Village. So, in essence, it is an important input to the plan. The council, I suppose, could have highlighted that, perhaps in relation to when we talk about the role and function at that point in the strategy. But I say we emphasise that it is an input, and of course it is a point in time. I think there's been representation already that there's an amendment to one of the villages in that. So we're conscious that it is in plans. We're happy to consider putting that in as a sort of as context for the evolution of the strategy. But the strategy itself, as you see, takes on board a number of factors. It has regard to that and other things. So you don't get an exact, and we probably don't in other plans either, direct relationship, proportional relationship, that is, between its role and function on the allocations. So for that reason, I think the council was minded initially to it distracts from the actual strategy itself and may confuse things, but we're happy to hear what people say on that.
Yes, so policy SCR wants to provide for the growth of settlements having regard to their role and function. Do you think there's ambiguity then as to what these settlements are and their role and function if it's not set out in the plan?
We do refer in the plan, in the supporting text just before that policy, and to the role and function, and we do earlier on when we're talking about the settlement structure in the borough as a whole of paragraph 2.7, we specifically refer to settlement role and function study. But as you say, for clarity, it may be that there's a benefit in doing that, although the council is, I have to say, sort of a bit reluctant, because it is the role and function as it is now, not what it will be at the end of the planned period. So we just need to appreciate that.
Okay, so just any comments on this before we sort of start getting into sort of justifications. The lady at the back.
From CPR in Kent, Countryside Charity. What we wanted to make was just very confusing for those that have actually produced the evidence to understand the relationship between the tiers A to G and the sustainability issue, in the sense of the developments being directed to the most sustainable communities, and then further confused when I believe that the settlement hierarchy, as we would normally imagine it, the main settlements and the local centres, is actually specified in policy. I think it's ED9, I haven't got my notes in front of me. I just think it's quite difficult to follow for people that are interested in the community who aren't perhaps planners and haven't gone through the evidence to actually understand how a settlement, what the nature of those settlements is. What's a B in relation to a G when you can't wade through all those complex documents behind. And I would just wish that it was put in a more simplistic way, the more regular way that you might have those settlements defined in our local plans. It just seems very complicated, very mystifying, and not particularly transparent.
Thank you, sir. Similar point just now. There is a settlement hierarchy in the draft plan, policy ED8 or ED9. The point is that it's in the...
Is that a retail hierarchy?
That's a retail hierarchy.
Yeah.
Well, it's in the employment section of the employment chapter. So it's a draft plan. So the council are content to produce a settlement hierarchy for that specific issue. But there isn't a settlement hierarchy in relation to housing specifically, or the development strategy as a whole, as the council have highlighted. They've set out their reasons why. But it would seem, for similar reasons as have just been mentioned, that for clarity's sake and to avoid confusion and to make it clear to those who want to develop, particularly for housing, that there was some indication of what settlement hierarchy is, and that should be included as part of the development strategy as a general point, and housing in particular. I think the council said that the settlement hierarchy and the study based on local services and some other things, which are exactly the sort of things that housing, when you're considering location of housing particularly, you are looking at. We're looking at the range of services, the availability of services, access to public transport particularly, and the sustainability in general terms of settlement, which is usually reflected in the settlement hierarchy. And on the back of that, you can then look at where you would be directing housing development, not just economic development. So I think there is some confusion there, and I'm going to expand it in my representation, so but it just in summary that I think is important.
Snow?
Thank you, sir. I have two points to make. The first point is to do with the exclusion of reference to the settlement hierarchy in the plan. This point is a sort of general application. It seems to me that there is a potential issue in not having an express reference to settlement hierarchy in the plan. For this reason, in the event that there is difficulty, and we say there will be difficulties in delivering the strategic sites, you potentially could be left with a situation where speculative development is coming forward to take advantage of that fact without any clear guidance in the plan as to where the most sustainable settlements are and how the hierarchy should be used to inform those particular decisions. So although that perhaps is a matter of less concern to my clients, I think it would suggest that it's more appropriate to have a settlement hierarchy included in the plan to assist those sorts of development management decisions. But our second point is a more fundamental point, which is in relation to the way in which the settlement role and function update study has been used. Now that comes up, I see that is one of the questions in question 3, but we have made submissions on that in relation to question 1. I'm content to come to that point in question 3 and deal with that.
Yeah, we'll come on to sort of how that's then being used, but just as a sort of starting point to actually understanding what that is. I think this is probably something that the council does need to look at, and I think it probably comes under the heading of effectiveness, but also consistency with policy. It's paragraph 20 of the framework, and it talks about, policies should set out the overall strategy, the scale, the type of distribution, etc. It falls under that. I think there's a lack of clarity here about, I picked up the plan, and the first thing I do is, okay, let's understand the context, let's understand the geography, let's understand how this thing works. And I was thinking, I would probably share the sort of views of representatives that I wasn't really sure what it was telling me. And we'll come on to the justifications this morning goes on about the focus of development and whether it's Bridge Wells or whether it's Canewood or whether it's, we'll come on to that. But in terms of the actual just fundamentally understanding the place and the context, I think that just needs to be set out. And it could probably be done through, the supporting text to zero best.
I've given this some thought, as you might imagine. And I noticed there are some other people who would like to speak. Would it be more appropriate for me to come back on this afterwards?
Yeah. Mr. Bond, and then we'll go around
Good morning, sir. Thank you very much. I was also going to raise the point of effectiveness in terms of the tests in the framework for soundness and so forth. And you're right. If you go through the plan, there are snippets that give an indication of settlement hierarchy, but it could be far more transparent and therefore effective if they are then spelt out. For instance, if you look at paragraph 2.4, the main settlements are listed, and I dare say there's a degree of hierarchy or order to that list. They're called Royal Tunbridge Wells, as is referred to in policy ED8, is the regional town. And if you just look over the page, the figure 3, the borough overview, it is quite clear, even looking at that diagram, that there is one significant and principal settlement, and that should be reflected in that settlement hierarchy for in terms of effectiveness and strategy, because then everything else filters down from that, and there should be then a greater degree of clarity on what then flows thereafter.
Yeah, and let's say we'll come on as the morning progresses to talk about the scale and distribution of development. I'm not saying that the plan, we're not going into that discussion yet, so I'm not saying that the plan should change. What I'm saying is that it's that context, it's that understanding of what the place is and the plan is and how that's going to work. I think Mr. Bond's right, I agree with him. You read the plan as a whole, page to page, and you get these snippets of what's going on, which is not clear. So for clarity and effectiveness, I think that is yes, lady down.
So Lisa Skin on behalf of the Brookside. It was just a quick one. We've got a bit of noise in the background. It's quite difficult for us to hear what the council's saying, because I appreciate they address you, but it's just when we've got noise in the background, it's really hard to hear what's going on. So if you could just bear that in mind. No, it's fine. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. There is an implied hierarchy, but I think, as everyone said, it's not clear. And our concerns relate to the fact that it tends to be more of a strategic hierarchy that's been referred to. And it doesn't really extend on to covering what we would call some of the rural areas. And we would be seeking for there to be clarification on basically the council looking to maximise sustainable development in some of those higher sort of villages that have been identified outside of the Greenbelt or the AONB. And to us, that's quite an important point because it seems to be missed. We appreciate there's general reference at point 3 to the growth of settlements, and when you look at point 9, it talks about sort of normally limits to development where countryside and non-countryside might be defined. I don't want to get into that at the moment because I think it comes up in issues later on. But I think it's quite correct to say when you take this local plan forward, and it will be used for development management purposes later on, this doesn't really help a DM officer to be making those decisions, because when they're looking at it and the public's looking at it, you don't seem to have that clarity on what's going on. We do support the council in the sense that it is an implied hierarchy that could be clarified and sorted, and it is a different type of approach to the traditional sort of put down the settlements, put a percentage split. And where they have actually looked at providing allocations, I think that is a positive step forward in the sense it does provide clarity and certainty for everyone. But I do think there's other issues, particularly for the rural villages, and sustainability needs to be highlighted in more detail. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I'll deal with it now. Can I just first of all distinguish ED8, which is a retail policy? So can we just put that to one side for a moment? In terms of bringing clarity to the plan, we have a settlement hierarchy grouping in the settlement role and function study, February 2021, on page 24. Which shows Royal Tunbridge Wells right at the top as one would expect, and then groupings beneath that. This is a snapshot in time. The situation is dynamic, and therefore that has to be understood. See no reason why the supporting text to STR1 should not also contain a reference to this, with an explanation of how it's been derived, and the fact that it may be subject to change as services change within these centres. Rather than putting hierarchy into a policy itself, so as to inform the reader of the plan as to how the strategy, spatial strategy of the plan has been derived in part, and also to inform future decision making. My friend Mr. Neil is correct to observe that it might be very important at that stage in dealing with development management decisions and having a reference to a hierarchy in the plan. So it's something we can give consideration to, certainly, and we could provide some text to be inserted in due course into that part of the plan, section 4, as a precursor to STR1.
I think because the policy refers to the role and function of settlements, they need to be, okay, so using Mr. Neil's example, you've got a development in settlement A. The requirement is that it's, it must reflect the role and function of that settlement. So you need to understand what is the role and function of that settlement. Therefore, for the policy to be effective, I think those settlements need to be listed in the supporting text. Now, that can be caveated to say, this is a snapshot in time, this is based on the document 2021. The concern I'd have is just cross-referring to the document and not listing them is, it doesn't really move it forward, it doesn't really assist, because then you've still got, local communities, decision makers, then going, okay, I've got to towards this document, and is that document being updated?
So I wasn't suggesting cross-reference.
Okay.
I was saying we should actually import this
I agree.
hierarchy into the plan.
Yeah, agreed. Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, sir. Just looking at policy STR1, point 3, paragraph 3. It still doesn't really provide the clarity that one would need to understand what the spatial distribution is going to be of growth within the borough. So all it does is it points to two areas, Canewood and Tubley Village. It doesn't actually give sort of housing figures or any other quantum of development in other settlements or other parts of the borough. So if you were to take the table, the hierarchy table, and put it in supporting text, that does seem like a logical thing to do. But then the council really needs to then set out what's the quantum of growth that's going to be distributed to each of the areas, because it's really unclear. All you have is the opening paragraph of 12,200 dwellings and 14 hectares of employment. Where that's going is really, where that's going and how much is going into each location is really unclear from this policy. And just coming back to that table as well, which we go into the supporting text, like you say, it doesn't really take us forward because it's the existing, council said it's a snapshot in time. But what's the future hierarchy look like for the settlements? Because this is what the plan is supposed to be doing, is telling us what the future of the borough is going to be. So I think that needs to be clarified as well. So where do the settlements fit in the future based on the growth that's in policy STR1?
Lady, yeah.
Lisa Skinner, Rothenbury. I understand what the council's saying in relation to, adding to the supporting text. But we all know there's a difference in terms of supporting text and what a planning policy actually states within the requirements. And I would still have to express my concern that it's far from clear how the council is approaching sustainable development in some of the more rural settlements rather than the strategic side. And therefore, we would still request that the policy is updated to include those points, or a separate policy is introduced to cover the matters that we referred to earlier. So, thank you.
Okay, I think we're straying into now actually what the strategy does. So we'll move on. And so this topic sort of expands as we go through. It's sort of literally about assessment hierarchy. The sort of questions 2 and 3, you probably take those together really. So the assessment role, function, study, update. So this scores the various assessments, groups them together. So 2 points really. Firstly, is that methodology robust and accurate? But also, what was the purpose of that study, and how has that informed the plan? So was it we're going to assess our settlements and direct growth to the most sustainable in inverted commas, or how did that sort of then feed into actually the strategy of the plan? Because we know that obviously Rolton as well is the biggest urban area, public transport, jobs, facilities, etc. We know from previous discussions through the essay is that obviously there's significant growth in paddock wood and in new settlement, etc. So how did that inform the plan?
I think as we say in the statement that in general terms the role and function of settlement is a starting point for looking at your growth, and indeed that's why it was done at the outset. So it was used most particularly, as we say in response to question 3, paragraph 24, through the sustainability appraisal, and which is why it's sort of quite a fine grain, because that informed the consideration of strategy options. It informed the consideration of site allocations. Indeed, it informed a number of development management policies as well. So the main purpose of the study was to build in the consideration of role and function into the development of the strategy.
So you're just talking about how it actually did that then? When you say informed, what did you do? Did you say, right, okay, we're going to look at allocations in groups A and B, or how did it actually inform the growth that's proposed in the plan? Not getting into site-specific detail, at that high level, how did it inform the strategy of the plan?
It informed the scores in the assessment in the sustainability appraisal on a number of objectives, most specifically on objective 16, which was to improve access to a range of key services and facilities. So the information was used to inform that particular assessment. So it fed into the overall assessment of sustainability for the settlement, which obviously goes well beyond that. It was used in that.
So in the sustainability appraisal, there's discussion of various options, and one of the options, I'm not looking at the page in front of me, I think was it main towns and villages within the essay. Okay. So in the sustainability appraisal, when you're looking at main towns and villages, what were the main towns and villages, and how did that correlate with this work? So in the essay, what were classes of main towns and villages?
I thought, sorry sir, I didn't have the essay in front of me, but I thought in the descriptions of the options, we identified which ones those were.
Yeah, I was looking for it, I couldn't find it.
Yes, so if I refer you to page 49, to main towns and large villages, we refer to Royal Tunbridge Wells, Southborough, Paddock Wood, Cranbrook, Walkhurst, Pembury, Rusthall. And then we give a proportion to the other villages in the next group down. So Cowhurst, Bennenden, Brenchley, Langton Green, Horseman Den. And those would have derived from the role and function study. So the distribution took those. You can see that the higher in the settlement hierarchy, the more development was attributed to them under that option.
Okay, so
Sorry, so that's reflected in table 4 of the distribution of housing allocations.
To an extent.
To an extent, it's based
Oh,
on.
okay.
So when you say, so talk about the essay, talk about how this study informed the sort of council's decision-making process. You said it informed, but it wasn't say strict. We are only going to look at allocations in settlements A, B, C, D. So when you were looking, and again this probably comes on to tomorrow's discussion about how you selected sites, but when you started to look at sites for selection method, again, how did you use this study? How did you use this evidence? So if someone puts a site forward and it's in a settlement that's ranked, I don't know, halfway down the table as well, how did you use this evidence to decide whether or not that was an appropriate place for housing growth?
As I say, it went into both the consideration of the these sites and also of the settlement options, but also of the sites themselves. And obviously the main process for that was the Sheila. And you'll see that within the Sheila there is a section of the consideration that essentially inputs the sustainability assessment from that. So I think it was a process that fed through into the actual consideration of sites. So that the actual facilities available was a positive or less positive factor in the consideration of particular sites. If I can, yeah. So that's, I think that's right. And I think the Sheila process, I'll explain on Friday, so we'll show that that was an integral part of the assessment of the sites. So inevitably, sites would have had a better score on a number of factors, or better favourable consideration for more sustainable settlements.
Okay, so let's take some views on this, the role and function study and how it's informed the plan. Gentleman, I think, next to Mr. Johnson, is it?
Yeah.
Maybe down there, yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to talk about the accuracy. Are we on to that yet?
You can do, yeah.
Yes. Elizabeth Aikenhead from Brenchley and Matfield Parish Council. If you're going to you rely on this study and possibly put it into the plan, it does need to be accurate. And in the case of Brenchley Village, it's not accurate. I have to apologise for a typo in our hearing statement, where 35 square feet should read 350 square feet. But the fact remains, we have not got a convenience store in Brenchley and haven't had since 2003. And I don't think 2003 is the snapshot in time we're talking about. The consultation was done during lockdown, during a time when the council was very short of councillors. We had a rotating chairmanship, and that's the only explanation I could give for the perhaps failure to pick up the difference between a convenience store and a convenience shop, which for people who are not well versed in planning is perhaps quite difficult to be done. But it does need to be corrected if it's going to be relied upon.
Would that change the, obviously we can show the council to look at that, would that change the overall categorisation of that settlement?
Yes, sorry. Well, firstly, I was going to say that it would require clearing the role and function study itself in CD 3.133 and in our statement under question 2. That the study is based on a snapshot in time and the current services and facilities that were available at that time. And that's just explained. We did consult all the parish councils and town councils when we were reviewing the role and function study. And they verified the list of services and facilities that were available in that settlement at that time. And we do say in paragraph 14 of our statement that although a number of premises and facilities were closed due to COVID-19 restrictions when we initially checked and did the desktop review, the consultation period was timely because we were coming out of restrictions at that time at the beginning of July. And in some cases, so basically you could get an idea of what premises had maybe closed, permanently closed, and what premises had reopened at the time. So we just want to be quite clear on that. It is a snapshot in time, and I can appreciate what Brenchley and Matfield are saying now, that things have changed and we have been through a lockdown. So yeah, we're going back to 2020 when it was reviewed, and we can accept that things are different now. Maybe there will be a possibility to review things before we put some sort of settlement hierarchy into the plan itself in terms of the groupings.
So just to answer your specific question, my understanding from my colleague is that Brenchley would actually drop down one category as a result of this sort of, the change. So I think it just goes to show what Mr. Bradley says in terms of it being a snapshot. I have to say also in terms of Brenchley, there's no practical difference in the sense that there are no allocations at Brenchley because of particularly, notwithstanding its position in the hierarchy, because of the recognised substantial heritage and landscape constraints. But it is an example of where something has changed. Yes.
I'm not advocating that you go back and completely redo that. But what I was saying is obviously if the lady's correct with that shop hasn't been there since 2003, then it might just be an error that's been picked up. So have a look at it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, we could have a look at that. But like I said, at the time we did get verification of the parish council and it wasn't picked up then.
It sounds like maybe an error that just needs to be picked up. Mr.
Thank you, sir. Just looking at the actual purpose and content of the study, we've set out in our position statement a concern that on its face, the settlement role and function study says that Tunbridge Wells itself is excluded from that study, albeit it's scored and summarised at the end. And we say that gives rise to a fundamental concern as to how, and this ties in with what Mr. Marley has been saying about the essay, how exactly it did inform the choices made in the essay in terms of the spatial strategy. If one looks at the purpose of the study, paragraph 1.4, it says the following. The settlement role and function study provides information about settlements in the borough of Tunbridge Wells and the services and facilities. And then it states, as well as providing an updated evidence base to help inform the settlement hierarchy of the borough, it also gives an indication of each settlement's level of sustainability, and this is the key part, and potential to accommodate further growth, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, it's the case that Tunbridge Wells is the main town in the borough is going to come at the top of the list. That's almost facile, doesn't need repeating. But we say the fact that it hasn't looked at Tunbridge Wells in itself as the main town underlines our fundamental concern that growth strategy 5, i.e. further growth around those main towns, hasn't been properly looked at. I accept entirely that of course Tunbridge Wells will be at the top, but that doesn't preclude a closer examination of exactly the key services and facilities within Tunbridge Wells and a proper study of those. So we say the fact that Tunbridge Wells has been excluded from the study is a flaw, and we would welcome an explanation as to why Tunbridge Wells, the main town itself, was excluded from the study.
Thank you, sir. Chris Huff, Sigma Planning on behalf of Lyden Homes. So there's been an administrative confusion, I believe, and that the hearing statement submitted by me for this session in the first deadline hasn't been carried forward to the second deadline. The effect of that means that I believe you haven't read it, and neither has anybody here. Would it be helpful in those circumstances just for me to give a very brief outline of my position, which I think probably make more sense to my contribution on other matters?
If it relates to this question and you've made representations on it, then yes.
It does, but I was going to give a general context before a specific point on this question.
Well, let's stick to the question if we may.
Right. So in terms of the settlement law and function study, that does in effect set out the settlement hierarchy, but paragraph 5.2 makes it very clear that settlement sustainability is no longer leading the spatial strategy. It had been leading it in the core strategy, and to some extent it was leading it in the Reg 18 version. Spatial has been downgraded in effect to one of a number of functions, which include transport, employment, economic, environmental, landscape, heritage and flooding, all of which are not directly matters that would have come into the settlement assessment. Now, there's no explanation of the weighting that's given to each of these factors in terms of their contribution to the forming of the proposed spatial strategy. And there isn't any explanation as to why the existing settlement sustainability approach to the spatial strategy is regarded as being no longer fit for purpose. So there's a very clear departure from this without any explanation. I don't know what the justification for that is, because the outcome of the issues and options exercise selected option 3, which was dispersed growth, development distribution proportional across all of the borough settlements. Now that strategy would need, to my mind, to be informed by a settlement hierarchy to ensure that the distribution is proportionate and optimum, but that hasn't been followed through into the submission plan.
I think in terms of Royal Tunbridge Wells, I think as was commented, it's a bit of a non-question really. It's clearly at the top of the hierarchy. We were conscious of that. It's been defined previously in many documents, and in the existing core strategy, the existing local plan. It's recognised as a sub-regional centre, and I think critically it scores, where if sites in Tunbridge Wells score highly in the relevant sustainability objectives accordingly. We didn't need to investigate that. What we needed to do is really check the lower order, the lower order settlements, That was the reason for that, and I don't think there's any actual material impact of not doing so. In terms of the original, this core strategy, spatial strategy, that was in a dealt with a different scale of development, and there were opportunities within the higher order centres to meet the need at that time. But that's since changed, and we've had to look more broadly, hence the range of different options that were considered.
Okay, any comments on questions 2 or 3?
If I could just, the last point from Mr. Myers, is that absolutely clear from the document itself, that it acknowledges and accepts that Royal Tunbridge Wells is clearly the primary settlement, and that the purpose and role of this study is not necessarily to look at that, but to look at the lower order settlements? If it's in there, fine, but if it isn't, it should be. Again, going back to the point of effectiveness. Because again, otherwise, if it's not there, and the point that Mr. Neil quite rightly said, that just draws on confusion, and then you get the impression that the ultimate spatial strategy of what I would be saying is a disproportionate amount of time focused at Canewood and Tudor Village is in part borne by the failure to fully recognise the status, suitability and role of Royal Tunbridge Wells.
So that's paragraph 1.6 mentions it. And the scope of the study, not the review of parts of the status of the main urban settlements. The study included and ranked in the final outcomes. I think it probably falls into, could be clearer, but it's, it's not part of the development plan, so I can't recommend any changes.
No. And that's the side problem. It's not part of the development plan, but it's be used to inform and.
So can I just point you to paragraph 2.4 of the local plan, where we essentially describe the settlements within the borough, which finishes at the reference I made earlier to the role and function study. And we do say Tunbridge Wells is the principal town and administrative centre. I think it is the principal town. We do understand that, and I don't think Mr. Bond needs to make that point. It's understood.
I think what we'll get on to is, obviously people around the table will probably get on to as well, is that, okay, clearly it is the principal town, okay, why hasn't it been the principal location for growth? Question 4 I want to take next, and probably take over to concentrate really, is that so you look at policy STR1, and that says that it supports the major transformational expansion of Canewood. And also when I refer to Canewood, I'm also being included in the line that so at the strategic level, without getting into site specifics, so look, taking that step back and thinking about strategic level, what was the justification for the level of growth at Canewood? Now, we've heard in previous sessions, and we've also read in the evidence as well, that Council's position is Canewood, it's not in the green, but I know that it's, it's got green belt release there, but essentially, not a settlement surrounded by land use constraints in the same way as other settlements. Obviously, it's got existing services, facilities there. But just in terms of the actual level, so you refer to as major transformational expansion, what was the justification for that sort of scale of the development proposed? Talking high level strategic sort of thinking is saying about the size of this.
So I'll just kick off on that. As you say, Canewood is the second largest town in the borough, and unlike Royal Tunbridge Wells, which is the largest town and the first place we would look at, it's not within the AONB, and the town itself isn't in the green belt. So having regard to national policy in terms of green belt and AONB, particularly in terms of major development, then we look outside those areas. Now there were a number of sites put forward as well during the call for sites process, and it was evident from that all around the town that there was substantial potential for growth of the town. The issue, as you say, was the scale of growth, and if there was a big scale, ensuring that was done on that was planned properly. And I suppose the other background point at the time, and it prevails now, is national policy, which is comes through the sustainability appraisal as well, of the benefits there can be in providing for large-scale growth through the significant expansion of existing towns, and that's highlighted in the NPPF. So there was a context of looking at these as sustainable options, but there's clearly a need to investigate that further. So hence, Mrs. Young, I'm sure, expand in due course, but strategically there was an opportunity for development at Canewood to provide substantial growth, but also benefits for the town as a whole in terms of it being addressed through a comprehensive approach at a large scale.
Yeah, we'll come on to that when we look at Canewood in terms of comprehensive development and how it all ties together, how it works, etc. In terms of the scale that was proposed at Canewood then, was that site-led? Was that this is going to accommodate a certain percentage? This is going to accommodate X number of dwellings? How did you determine the actual level of development there? And this goes back to what we talked about before about the sort of the settlement role and function study and the essay, at what stage did the council make that decision and say, well, we know that Canewood's going to take some development because it's not going to be developed, it's not in the AONB, second largest town, it's got services, facilities. At what stage did you determine and how did you determine the actual level of development there? Was that site-led or was it predetermined strategy-led? This is going to accommodate 20% of our growth. This is going to, how did you actually determine that scale of that?
I don't think we would ever work on percentages on that basis because you have to, context is everything. Obviously there was a limited capacity elsewhere, as you say, because of Greenbelt and AONB. But in terms of Canewood specifically and the levels of growth, we did look at a range of options through the sustainability appraisal for the scale and the distribution of growth. And my colleague,
and that's in the essay.
Yeah, you see various diagrams, or essentially.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm referring to the sustainability appraisal for the local plan, page 99.
Yeah.
So we looked at those different scales and distributions of growth, and it's fed through that. We reappraised it posted between the draft local plan, and it was reviewed in the light of comments at the draft local plan stage, and sort of options, further options were looked at subsequently as well.
And presumably that was as a result of a core science exercise where obviously developers would tables put sites to you, and at that stage the council presumably then considered, okay, well this is what's available in Paddock Wood.
Yes, absolutely. You see from the call for sites, there was many sites, and it was a broad spread. So I suppose that looked at that advised on the availability of sites, but obviously the council then had to still make the decision in terms of whether it was an appropriate location in which to build. So it was looked at, as I say, not just at the individual site level, but overall for Paddock Wood, principally through the sustainability appraisal.
Could I just ask for that reference that you just provided?
Sorry.
You mentioned page 99.
Yeah, it's the sustainability appraisal of the local plan. Sorry, I don't have the CD number. And it's page, I said page 99.
98.
But it's really 98, isn't it? It's the text. Yeah. You may also want to refer back to the draft local plan, which had took a similar sort of approach, although it's one less option.
Okay, but at a high level, excuse me, at a sort of high level strategic, taking a step back, looking at the borough, looking at the geography of the area, it was essentially unconstrained. I use that context. I know that Mr. Hazel talked about flooding, etc., but unconstrained in the context of Rolton as well, AOB, Greenbelt, etc., second largest town. That's what essentially initially took you to look at that location. Yeah. Okay, we'll start at the top this time. We'll work our way back to the question.
Thank you, sir. It might just help if you look at the development strategy topic paper and the section starting on page 34 of that comments on the land at Paddock Wood, and para 6.83 comments about the size and location and scale of development, and basically recognises that scale is important for functionality and sustainability of new settlements to provide sufficient support for everyday services, etc. And basically, when you're looking at the level of development that was being promoted around Paddock Wood and the principles of actually promoting the sustainable new settlement and improvements to the existing settlement, there is a relationship between how much you actually look to promote and actually then what you can achieve out of it, whether that is through the provision of new facilities within the town itself or through improvements to infrastructure in and around the town. And that is what is being looked at in Paddock Wood. It's major growth, but it's major growth that is bringing with it significant benefits for the town.
Okay, Mr. Bond.
Thank you, sir. There are a number of places where I can make this point. So I apologise in advance. It's a slightly recurring theme, but Mr. Marlowe quite rightly said, he sort of looked at me when he said it, pleasant and polite smile on his face, that of course we look at Tunbridge Wells first. That's what he said. In terms of justifying in response to your question, the justification for the level of, at a strategic level, the level of development at Paddock Wood and at the same time Chewley Village. In relation to Paddock Wood, so the council look at Royal Tunbridge Wells first, and then they know limited capacity primarily because of the Greenbelt and AOB. And as a result of that, then they go to places like Paddock Wood. However, and unfortunately, when you read their matter 3 statements throughout, that is on the premise that they had assessed and discounted all reasonable options at the primary settlement of Royal Tunbridge Wells. And I repeat, I apologise again for making the same point, but the opportunity to the north of Tunbridge Wells, albeit in its refined form, has not been assessed in the essay, and therefore through the appropriate mechanism of this plan-making process. And as a result of that, the council cannot say to you, in my view, sir, that they have explored through the settlement hierarchy the realistic options at the primary settlement before going to look at the options at Jubilee Village and Paddock Wood. And that's the point made in one statement and further the stage 1 sessions, and repeated them throughout our written statements to the various stages of this EIP. I hope I don't have to make that point again, but I will just reiterate that when you read the council's assumptions and justification, that's what it's all about, for Jubilee Village and Paddock Wood, that is on an incomplete assessment that, in my view, gives rise to issues of soundness over the spatial strategy and distribution of development. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Firstly, just want to pick up the point about the percentages. And the council said that it's never looking at percentages as a way to determine whether we should okay for certain locations. But I think the sustainability appraisal actually looks at, they actually test a number of the scenarios are based on putting percentages of development within different settlements. So I think there's an inconsistency there in terms of the oral representation that we just heard from the council. In terms of how did the council decide on Paddock Wood? I think paragraph 4.42 of the submission of the plan summarizes that. So it says, having seized all reasonable opportunities for growth across the board, meeting the housing need can only be met if the development strategy includes the strategic growth of certain settlements. And it goes on to say the position has been reviewed, and based on site assessment work, there's very little scope for more housing in rural settlements, major developments in AOP, or dispersal of large amounts of development, some smaller settlements with few facilities. And then it goes on at 4.43 to say, it's found that even promoting all suitable Sheeloft sites for allocation of local plan, the borough could only meet only a fraction of its housing need without the provision for strategic sites, namely Paddock Wood and Jubilee Village. Just the evidence that we've seen doesn't bear that out in terms of having looked at every possible option to make that conclusion that the only possible place to put the growth is in Paddock Wood and Jubilee Village. It's pretty shocking.
Does a council need to consider every possible conceivable option? If the council's got a town, and the council says, we've got town A, and it's unconstrained, notwithstanding the comment about flooding, etc., it's unconstrained in the context of our other large town. Therefore, we are going to direct growth towards that town. Does the local planning authority need to consider every other potential possible alternative?
Well, the starting point for me was the fact that the council said that it had looked at every other Sheeloft site and presumably looked at every single reasonable alternative within those Sheeloft sites. I think in terms of what I was about to go on to say was about, I was very surprised to hear the council not talk about flood risk in terms of looking at Paddock Wood. It wasn't even mentioned in their consideration. I think we were told that there are a number of sites that have been promoted by landowners. They looked everywhere else. That's where the sites were available. Therefore, let's put all the housing in Paddock Wood. What they should have done in MPPF is really clear about this. And we've talked about Greenbelt and what the MPPF says about Greenbelt, A and B. But it's just strong in terms of flood risk. Paragraph 161 of MPPF says all plans should apply a sequential risk-based approach to the location of development, taking into account all sources of flood risk, so as to avoid where possible flood risk to people and property. And 162 says the aim of the sequential test is to steer new development to areas with the lowest risk of flooding from any source. And development should not be allocated or permitted if there are reasonably available sites appropriate so that proposed development in areas with a lower risk of flooding. So surely within the council's process in terms of working out where to, spatial strategy and where to deliver the growth, they would have had to have gone through that process to say, are there areas with the lowest risk of flooding that could take this growth before the locations within Paddock Wood? And it's just not. Council hasn't explained that to be the case.
We've got a specific question on flooding.
Yes, it's explained in great detail.
But I do think it's important to pick it up now, because in terms of, it's not a sort of separate consideration, but this is a consideration along with AONB and Greenbelt in terms of working out, where could you possibly reasonably locate growth within the borough? Why wouldn't flood risk have come into that same consideration as AONB and Greenbelt exceptional circumstances?
Flood risk is within the Sheila assessments and within the SA as a consideration. So throughout the consideration of the size and spatial strategy, flood risk is really part of
that. Thank you, sir. In terms of the specific question you asked, which was how did the specific levels of growth at Paddock Wood, how are they looked at and how are they assessed? Like all these things, one needs to apply a little bit of rigor and scrutiny to assertions made, it's all in the SA and that sets it all out. In my submission, the reference is given to the consideration of the different options at Paddock Wood in the SA are extremely brief. And the key point in terms of consideration of Greenbelt, you can see how that features in the option area for the scale of growth of Paddock Wood on page 102. And it just simply, this is the only mention, as far as I can see, in looking at the appropriate options for growth of Paddock Wood. It's the only place where, as far as I can see, Greenbelt is considered.
Sorry, just what was the reference?
Page 102 of CD 3.62. And you can see there under land use consideration, we have the scoring and the colours are all the same, pretty much. And the only reference we get to Greenbelt, it just simply says, however, options 2 and 4 are slightly worse, as also include the release of Greenbelt land with overall harm rating of high. Now, if that is, and then I've looked for any further detailed reasoning as to why option 2 was favoured, and we can only see, if one scrolls down, the only conclusion I can see is that paragraph 6.2.49, electronic page 108, where it says following, if you have that reference there, the electronic referencing is slightly different to the internal pagination. Paragraph 6.2.49, drawing on the above findings and other more detailed assessments, which point towards option 2 being favoured, further consideration is given to related transport infrastructure below. Now, in my submission, that cursory reference to Greenbelt really highlights what we said in our submissions on the sustainability appraisal, that Greenbelt considerations were not put at first and foremost in the consideration of the options, both in terms of the selection of the two garden settlement strategy, and when one looks at the more granular level at what particular areas of growth and what particular options around Paddock Wood are appropriate. You mentioned earlier, sir, at Paddock Wood, no greenbelt, etc. But of course, the east capable elements of Paddock Wood extension is greenbelt, and indeed there is it borders, I think, at the south, the AONB. So it's simply not good enough to say, oh, it's all in the SA and we just punt for option 2. Greenbelt consideration should have driven the optioneering at this stage. Setting aside whether that passes the legal test for legal adequacy of sustainability appraisal, it is wholly concerning that the harm to Greenbelt there by that particular option 2 westward extension into East Capel is not given proper and due consideration. Now, it will all be said, well, that's a matter for weight and consideration. Policy decisions it had to make, but the evidence simply isn't there justifying why option 2, amongst all those other options, and that westward expansion into the East Capel Greenbelt area was considered appropriate. And I'm afraid the explanation we've had from Mr. Marlowe is entirely superficial, and we need something better than that to justify why that expansion in that particular direction was chosen. Thanks, sir. Those are my...
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, sir. In response to your question, you have to examine every single site in the main town before moving to the second level town. The answer to that, to me, is yes, but not necessarily in that context. It's in the context of the housing need and the fact that capacity at Tunbridge Wells has to be optimised, irrespective of what happens at Canewood. So you should do that exercise, and certainly my position is that Tunbridge Wells has considerable capacity that can either meet the additional housing need that we've heard a lot about, or as a replacement, a partial replacement to Tudor.
So just on that, so just to assist, is the answer to that question you posed at least all reasonable alternatives? And that's the point I was making. Through the SA process, at least, there are other alternative, reasonable alternatives should have been examined. It's that what I said I've got some issues with.
Yeah, we're aware about that. Because the council took a position that, in their view, their judgment, they did consider all the reasonable alternatives. You guys want to come back on any point, just particularly in response to the points about the SA and its sort of treatment of the western expansion of
the SA is an extremely important component of the open space theory. Its main purpose is not to assess the heart of Greenbelt, which is done independently by the Greenbelt study, a matter which we're coming on to in due course. All of those things, all that information, inform decision making. And it's a bit unfair, actually, to suggest that all responses here represent all that is relied upon. It's not. So if you, in your own time, you don't need to go through it now, look at the development strategy topic paper. I don't have the CD on the side. It's February 2021. You will see clearly those matters the local planning authority took into account in coming to the decision it did in relation to the growth option for Paddock Wood. Clearly set out there the reasoning behind it. And specifically, I draw your attention to paragraph 6.85. Sorry, 6.81.
Okay, any other comments, observations on question 4?
So it's just a short point, but just in terms of the point I was making earlier, which I don't think is, I take the point that Mr. Shardavian is making about other references to it, but the other references to the policy decision to expand westward. But I would just like you to bear in mind the actual numbers that in terms of this expansion, the westward expansion into East Capel, one looks at the total allocation in Canewood, the strategic allocation. That is, and I haven't got the particular references, but I'm informed, and I'll be correct if I'm wrong, that's 3,600. 2,100 of that is in East Capel. So that gives you a sense of the bulk and the weight of development that has been apportioned into that westward limb. And I know, so you've seen the various diagrammatic representations of that, and I think you gave reference earlier. But that just gives you a sense of what we're talking about. But that is the scale of westward expansion that we're dealing with into those areas covered by Greenbelt. We'll look. I don't want to get into the detail of which we'll cover in matter 6 as the appropriateness of and in more detail the appropriateness of these particular allocations. But in my submission, this does all boil down to, I'm afraid, the sustainability appraisal, because it is at that stage, for the reasons we already set out in matter 1, and I appreciate Mr. Shardavian wasn't there for that. This whole strategy of the T-garden strategy was effectively baked in at the regulation, that key point when it came up at regulation 18. So, and that was all driven, we were told, by considerations in the sustainability appraisal. So one can't say, oh, don't worry about sustainability appraisal, there are other documents around. This was all driven, so we were led to believe in matter 1, by considerations set out in the essay. So I would just approach with caution the idea that the essay is just there as a decision guiding document. It was an absolutely essential part, so we were led to believe, of the way in which this garden settlement strategy, which baked in onto the Greenbelt, we say, was an item. But those points will no doubt come back to in matter 6 in any event. I just wanted you to make sure that you have a sense of the numbers that are involved in terms of the westward expansion element. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
I think we discussed at stage 1. I've got notes of this, but pretty sure we discussed at stage 1 that the essay, yes, it's testing reasonable alternatives. Yes, it's informed strategy, but it's not some sort of magic black box that you can plug lots of sites into. It's going to tell you which ones to allocate. There's going to be judgments. There's going to be difficult decisions. There's going to be, officers have to make decisions based on other factors, being about assessments which we'll talk about, flooding, highways, transport. So I think that's part of it. We will go on this page. We'll go to.
Thank you, sir. There's in relation to the essay as well, in table 29 of the essay, which is page 100 to page 103, I believe. 103. Again, I think it's important just to understand what the council's thinking was in terms of looking at adequate and the options that were presented through the essay. And the only place that I can see within this where it actually looks at flood risk as an issue is under water, under sustainability objective water. And we heard in stage 1 as well about how the council considered, one of the key reasons for locating the growth at Paddock Wood was for flood risk betterment. The council explained that because there are such great flood risk issues there that we're going to put our student growth at Paddock Wood, which is going to improve the flood risk of the area. And that's borne out here in what the council, how they assess the water objective, which isn't a negative. It's a mixed water score, as they call it. It says there's going to be a substantial demand for water and wastewater treatment, and all would provide significant benefits to Paddock Wood and Canewood in the form of reductions in existing flood risk. So the council assessed that putting more development, strategic development, thousands of houses and employment is actually going to improve the flood risk situation for Paddock Wood. And it says that the benefits are going to be even greater for options 2 and 4, where developments directed to the areas of flood zone 2 and 3 west of Paddock Wood. So the higher the flood risk, so where you locate the development, if you put it in the higher flood risk area, it's going to actually improve the flood risk for the whole of Paddock Wood and those areas. I think it's important that this is a fundamental sort of decision-making consideration for the council in terms of how can we put development at Paddock Wood. Well, to do so, we're going to have to improve the flood risk, not just future flood risk, but existing flood risk for Paddock Wood. So really keen to understand how the council proposes to build that into the plan.
We'll come to that. Ms. Ashton?
Thank you, sir. Likewise, I'd like to come back to the matter of flood risk later on and deal with question 7 of issue 2 this afternoon, probably. Just 2 very brief points for you, sir. Paragraph 6.2.21 of the essay, the very last sentence, in both Paddock Wood and Canewood, the 2 key considerations are greenbelt and flood risk, with the potential to generate improvements to existing flood risk. The other point I wanted to make is in terms of a correction as to the scale of growth being proposed in and around Paddock Wood. If you look at CD 3.66, which is the David Locke Associates Strategic Sites Master Plan and Infrastructure Study, and in particular page 94 of that document, you have table 6, which is the capacity for the option 1 proposals, which is the chosen option. That clearly sets out what is being proposed to the northwest, southwest, east and west of Paddock Wood. And I think in particular, my client would take quite great umbrage at the fact that we are promoting 1,200 units to the east of Paddock Wood, which is not in the Greenbelt or the AINB. So to suggest the scale of development to the west that is in Greenbelt is as high as it is, I'm afraid, not in compliance with that document or what is being proposed.
Yeah, the ladies you want to.
Thank you, sir. Jane Piper, on behalf of Crest Nicholson, northwest of Paddock Wood. I just felt it was important to stress how the essay fits in with everything. We've heard in part 1 and yesterday the difficulties that the council have had bringing the right number of units forward to fulfil its housing need and to help its community and provide for its community, particularly given the affordability issues that were discussed in detail yesterday. But so that we have an authority here, unlike its neighbours, willing to take its housing numbers. They have very limited opportunities and options within the physical constraints. And that is set out right at the very front of the local plan in figure 3, which clearly identifies the land in the Greenbelt, in the AINB, and in flood zone 3. So any question that those aren't equally valued is incorrect, because that's set out right at the beginning. but also to say that in accordance with NPPF paragraph 11A, the council have done the right process. They've looked at sustainable development through the essay, and they looked at options around Paddock Wood in regard to sustainability and the best way of producing development that balances social, environmental and economic factors. Then they've gone on to look at the SFRA and the exceptional circumstances to take land out of the greenbelt that is in Capel and Paddock Wood. That is part of a process, and just picking out one document and saying that's flawed is not correct, and it has to be seen within the whole context of the evidence produced. And obviously your questions will go on to those elements, but I just wanted to make that point that it is in accordance with the NPPF 11A by looking at sustainable development first and then looking at exceptional circumstances to take land out. And what is clear about that is flooding is very much part of that, as is the other social and economic factors that the council are required to meet. Thank you, sir.
Okay, finally, Councillor. Oh, sorry, Mr. Smith.
Just a very brief point. So I recall, as you do the discussion around the sustainability appraisal, and that there are matters of balance and judgment and assumptions to be made having regard to the sustainability appraisal that was discussed many weeks ago. I think there was some concern and disquiet around the table as part of that discussion back then as to where we would find those balancing judgments and assumptions made, how they were recorded, and how they were then used to inform the development strategy. I think that was the general point that people made at the time and is being reflected in discussion now.
You asked the question really about the strategic level here, so I won't get into the detail of some parts of Paddock Wood that are subject to flood risk, and council fully appreciates that and has looked to, as is set out, consider the opportunities that the growth provides for investment to address that. We had the discussion on SA, and we did, and I remember Mrs. McCloy talking about the treatment of greenbelt in that, and in fact the example you just pointed to in relation to water for Paddock Wood also deals with greenbelt. It was part of the consideration of the land use, as was flood risk in relation to water. They are important considerations, and it is, as Lady quite rightly said, it's part of the process that's refined through further work, as you'll come to do. I have to just pick up on one point and hesitate to do this because I'm sure we all need a break, but in relation to Castle Hill, Mr. Bond's mentioned now a couple of times that we haven't assessed the options there. I don't believe that to be true. There's been a number of options submitted at different stages, including the draft plan and indeed most recently the pre-submission plan. All those have been considered, and I'm happy to perhaps speak out of the meeting with them if there's any confusion on that, but they have been considered. The range of development scales have been considered. I think varied initially from 980 to 1600, and then the later one at the submission, at the pre-submission stage, down to 900. Those have all been considered. We refer, and the Sheila wasn't required to be amended accordingly, which I think is where you may be coming from, but they were certainly considered, and we went through that process and we recorded it in our response in the consultation statement, which is CD 313B, and page 256, Mr. Bond's benefit, is the reference that was our summary of that, which we did conclude it didn't need a revision to the Sheila. Just in case, you know, I don't want that to sort of niggle off.
Okay, we'll take a break. Want to adjourn, want to resume, want to move on to the second part of the question, which is really about obviously the assessment of student village, and also considering a bit more focus on as well as town. So those 15 minutes until 20 past. Gentlemen, we'll continue. Okay, so the next question really I want to explore is similar to the question around the Paddock Wood example, but in the context of the new settlement at Tudor Village. So again, taking that step back and not getting into site specifics in great detail, but at that strategic level, what were the reasons for pursuing a new standalone settlement at Tudor Village, rather than the expansion of existing towns or villages in particular? I know we've touched upon this slightly already in the context of the sustainability appraisal, but just explain to me how the strategy got to the stage of having, firstly, a new standalone settlement, and secondly, the location of that settlement. The principle of it and then the location of it, how those two things go about.
I'll kick off then, so Mr. Bourne may sort of has been involved for a long time as well, may chip in. I think you go back to the issues and options stage of the plan making process, where a new settlement was mooted at that point without any location specified. And of course, you know, as I said earlier in relation to Paddock Wood, it resonated with the NPPF at the time to investigate such options, and we knew because of the I'm sure the council knowing the borough so well, thought it may be necessary to look at this as well in the context of the environmental constraints in the borough. So it consulted on that. It consulted on other options as well in terms of distribution. One of which was actually the sort of around sort of the A21, sort of that side of Tunbridge Wells, Pembury, I should say. There was some support for that. It was after the A21 corridor, the sort of preferred option, and the two together were preferred, so the council looked at it further, essentially. We had, there were sites submitted as well for a new settlement, and of course the process, it's not a sequential one in the sense, you know, this went on running in parallel with the consideration of sites for the expansion of settlements. The sites that were submitted, in fact, other potential locations were considered through the sustainability appraisal. Most of the locations were within the AONB, and it was found that such a substantial strategic development of, in the AONB was not appropriate. So, although the clear preference was to look outside the green belt, there were no sustainable locations there that were suitable. We referred previously in relation to Horseman Den and Frittenden, and to a degree Sissinghurst as well. So it then became a question of looking at where there was the potential in the green belt without harming the integrity of the green belt, well, having regard to its purposes. I'm sure I may be corrected. The consideration was really of, as we've set out, sort of a balanced one, in all fairness. There are clearly adverse effects in terms of green belt, particularly. also it provides the potential to contribute to housing needs through a relatively sustainable development. That process wasn't conclusive at that stage, and further work was, as I've said earlier, was then undertaken to look at the both the appropriateness through the master planning exercise and the deliverability of that proposal. And say, on balance, the council has found that it is a sustainable proposal and would make a sort of a meaningful contribution in a sustainable manner with the relevant infrastructure needed to incorporate it within the plan.
Just on this, yes, I think it's the point that Mr. Neal was making yesterday, that sort of sense checking as you go along through the various stages. So it was in the Regulation 18 plan, correct? Yeah, and that was 2019.
Yes.
So as some of these evidence-based documents then sort of started to emerge and progress in more detail, how did you sort of, or at what stage did you sort of, again, stop, take that step back? Is there still an appropriate strategy? Is it still justified? Or was it more, we've got the Regulation 18 plan, and then we're going to produce the evidence to substantiate and support it? Which I think is already criticism of this piece.
I think that's an unfair criticism, honestly. Obviously, there was a lot of feedback at the draft local plan stage. It was the first time this had been mooted as a proposal, and there was clearly an understandable opposition to that level. The sustainability appraisal was reviewed and another option considered, in fact, and it took into account more recent information. But rather than, I wouldn't present it as a step back, it was more a question of, are these assumptions well founded? Can flood risk be addressed? It can, other aspects of sustainability and deliverability be addressed. Is the harm as anticipated, or is it worse? In which case, the situation may well have changed. And indeed, the council undertook the Greenbelt, the Greenbelt Stage 3 work and the AOMB setting report, specifically in response to those issues, to help it determine, in essence, whether the exceptional circumstances test was met. I think, sorry, so the other point one just reminded me is that clearly if there had been other options that we felt were more suitable coming in, post-draft local plan, then that could have presented a better option, but it didn't.
Okay,
I'm great. So at the risk of repeating myself, I make no apology for it. I will be going back to some of the points made about the SA. And the reason I say this in this regard is the following. There is a legal duty that when reaching decisions as to what should be included in plans, those decisions should be informed by sustainability appraisal. So I just wanted to make that clear, because there were some comments earlier that the SA is just one factor. Well, it's more than that. Decisions have to be informed by the SA, and also the reasons why decisions are set out. Decisions that have been taken have to be set out in the SA. So I just want to be very clear about the importance of the SA process, and not just to downgrade it as one other factor. But that's my first observation. But secondly, in relation to why the strategic site at Chudley was chosen as opposed to any other site, needs to be seen in context in the way in which decisions were made between the issues and option stage, Regulation 18 and Regulation 19. Now, Mr. Marley has just explained, in effect, that at the issues and option stage, there was the council at that stage seems to be preferring a new settlement strategy, but along the A21 corridor, and I'm summarising, but that's as I understood it. But that was, of course, and we've already made this clear in issue 1, that was on the premise, and the new settlement strategy was on the premise that it would not require the release of Greenbelt land. That was, and we set that out in relation to matter 1. So we then moved to a world where at Regulation 18, we now have a settlement strategy that does require the release of Greenbelt land, and more to the point, a significant amount of it. And that when you ask, well, at what stage was a step back taken, and when did the council really think, is this the right approach? That's where things went wrong, because Greenbelt land, the premise was for a new settlement strategy at the outset of the plan making process that it wouldn't require the release of Greenbelt land. And suddenly, as soon as site availability comes forward and an owner, Hadlow Estate, says, actually, we can provide this, the council says, okay, great, let's go for this site at Chudley, but without thinking actually that completely compromises the very premise of its settlement strategy. So that's my sort of first macro point in terms of.
And was there, and at that stage then, so council went from issues and options, a new settlement, probably not within the green belts. So at that stage, was there an option on the table? Was there the possibility of an option, a new settlement in a location beyond the green belt boundary? So you've got an option, issues and option stage, and okay, once we see this new settlement idea, what have we got? What are the options? Was there anything at that stage?
As far as I'm aware, sir, not at the issues and options stage. There was obviously the site that I'm not aware that there were sites that were being considered at all at that stage. And you're quite right to typify it in the sense that it was supported by the SA in principle, obviously, preferably, and scoring better outside the green belt, obviously, and the NMB as well. But unless Mr. Bourne can advise otherwise, I don't think there are any particular locations in mind for putting that forward, that option forward.
Sorry,
sir.
Yeah. So that's the overarching point. You have our submissions on matter 1. They're first and foremost, we completely rely on these in respect of the appropriateness of strategy of selecting Chudley itself for that two-gone settlement strategy. The second point, when one actually looked at why Chudley and is that appropriate, when one actually looks at the reasons, and we can see essentially that those reasons are set out in the development strategy topic paper by the council. The reasons largely, and we can see that perhaps the best reference in fact is the council's own its position paper that's in respect of this under this particular matter. The council said this, in terms of the background to pursuing a new standalone settlement. In brief, the answer is the creation of a standalone settlement was seen as a potentially sustainable means of accommodating a significant amount of new development. You'll see the word potentially. Now I'll come back to that, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on that particular word in the position statement. But the reason I draw attention to it is because at that stage, when the decision was made to select Chudley as a garden settlement, we say insufficient evidence was before the council to decide and to make the decision that it was indeed a sustainable location for growth. And the reason we say that, as we set out in our position statement, is there were a number of things still that had not been tied down in respect of, for example, the necessary transport infrastructure and the deliverability of that for this particular settlement, which is absolutely crucial for its sustainability credentials. We know, for example, that we've received further highways evidence in the course of this examination, and there's a further addendum report that we'll be discussing in matter 6. But on any analysis, the conclusion that it would be a sustainable location, there simply wasn't that degree of evidence and investigation carried out to enable the council to actually reach that location, that decision at that stage. We've set out, and we'll refer in more detail in matter 6 to some of the other problems in relation to the site-specific problems in relation to Chudley. But the final point in terms of the strategy at a strategic level, choosing Chudley, we say where things have gone wrong is in this question of balance. You heard them mentioned by Mr. Marlowe. Effectively, we made a balanced decision. On balance, we decided that we would go to, that we would choose, we thought Chudley was an appropriate site for this settlement. Well, in my submission, that's not quite right. It's not about balance, and that really highlights the fundamental flaw in the way the council's approached Greenbelt. The critical question here is whether there were exceptional circumstances to alter the boundaries of the Greenbelt to accommodate this new settlement. And just downgrading the status of Greenbelt policy to something that should be weighed in the balance, in my submission, is a flawed approach. And you can see that downgrading of the prominence and the importance of Greenbelt policy throughout the decision-making documents. One can see it you can see it in the position statement of the council. You've heard it today from Mr. Marlowe, and just for the reference, paragraph 64 of their position statement, the council says this: the benefits and compensatory improvements have to be weighed against the loss of Greenbelt, as well as some heritage and landscape impacts. Although a finely balanced judgment, it's concluded that it's appropriate and more acceptable that the harms would stem from further growth of the existing towns and villages beyond that within the local plan. In my submission, that is the incorrect approach. Exceptional circumstances should have been first and foremost in the consideration of council when choosing this particular location for one of the two garden settlements that have been identified by the council. So I won't go into all the details at this stage. I don't think you necessarily want submissions on all the detail about the site-specific circumstances of Chudley. But I think those are the main points I want to make at this stage as to why we say the strategic decision to identify Chudley is fundamentally flawed.
So at that stage, then, how did the council? You talked about judgment and weighing things in the balance. So at that stage, is it right that you didn't have the greenbelt assessment, so you didn't have greenbelt assessment stage 3 at that Reg 18 stage, did you?
No, we had the stage 2 greenbelt assessment.
You had stage 2. So how did the council, again, sort of judgments and weighing up in the balance, reach the view that that was going to be an appropriate strategy when you didn't at that stage understand what the impact on harm to greenbelt would be?
In terms of this is at the draft local plan stage, from draft local plan. The greenbelt stage 2 work was itself, it was stage 2. We had the strategic greenbelt assessment followed by stage 2, which looked at broad areas and parcels. So I think that was fairly detailed greenbelt assessment.
So you had the stage 2 at that stage?
Yes. Obviously, at the regulation 18 stage, it's fair to say, when you're producing a consultation draft, you don't have everything, and there were clearly there were sites indeed that were consulted on at the time where further evidence suggested that they weren't appropriate and subsequently deleted. But we had enough evidence, including transport evidence at that time, to consult on it as a proposal.
If I could just add, so before I think Mr. Scully talks about the stage 2 greenbelt study, that there's a whole raft of evidence at that stage in relation to landscape, in relation to transport, the stage 2 study that enabled the council to reach the view that it was potentially sustainable. We were clear that there were further matters that required further work if it were to be taken forward. And as Mr. Marlowe said, if those had come back, then the council, those had come back and said that demonstrated it wasn't sustainable or indeed deliverable, then the council would have had to have rethought. And the one which is of particular, I suppose, pertinence, 2 areas were in relation to infrastructure, and the council, having regard to the comments that were received at Regulation 18 stage, commissioned the infrastructure study led by David Locke Associates, which looked at both Tewkesbury and Paddock Wood. And again, the council was also upfront that the viability work, which underpinned the Regulation 18 stage, that further work was required in relation to the strategic sites, and that was set out at draft local plan stage, and the council was upfront about that, and that work was undertaken between draft local plan pre-submission plan stage to demonstrate, and ultimately demonstrated that the council's initial views were correct, and finally balanced judgment could be taken forward. Mr. Scully, perhaps you could just relate the stage 2 greenbelt study.
The stage 1 and stage 2 greenbelt studies form the body of the council's greenbelt review, and its results of those studies provide a reliable basis for spatial strategy and proposed allocations. When they covered the whole of the greenbelt around the borough, including land beyond the greenbelt, and divided it up into the appropriate parcels controlled. The stage 3 study was primarily to understand the particular effects of the proposal and to address any concerns that have been raised as to full matters such as mitigation and so on. So, in terms of reaching a judgment at Reg 19, the stage 2 study and the stage 1 study were sufficient to inform that process and were taken into account. We're coming on to that tomorrow, so that's more detail.
Just want to be absolutely clear. The stage 1 and stage 2 studies, if we're now being told that those formed the basis for that decision, afraid that's absolutely bizarre, because those studies decided that the release of greenbelt caused by these two strategic sites would be very high. So that's the conclusion of those two greenbelt studies. So, and we know, and we'll come back, I expect we come back to this when we look at these greenbelt studies in the next matter, but those don't actually contain the exceptional circumstances considerations in the text. And we'll look at that in more detail. And I see Mr. Shadarabian shaking his head. The exceptional circumstances decision, the evidence for that, has to be elsewhere when one looks at those greenbelt studies in detail. So what we don't understand is how, if those two studies referred to by Mr. Scully said that there was going to be very high harm, on what possible basis could the exceptional circumstances test have been met? I mean, it doesn't, they don't provide any justification. It would be one thing if those came back and said, actually, the level of harm on these two strategic sites is quite low, and therefore one could say exceptional circumstances. They said the opposite. They said it was very high. So we don't understand at all how those two studies help inform why the council didn't go back to the beginning and look again and say, is, for example, the A21 growth corridor a better place for this? And really interrogate why it is that a garden strategy settlement with premised on greenbelt release was appropriate. There just wasn't that stock take at that stage. And the evidence to the contrary was pointing in the opposite direction.
I might just say, the greenbelt assessment wouldn't include the exceptional circumstances. That's a matter for the council to undertake separately, and we will come on to that tomorrow. In terms of the findings of the greenbelt study, that's not determinative of whether a site should be released or not. Whether it has a low level of harm or a high level of harm, it doesn't mean to say the site should be released. And so there's the other matters to be taken into consideration.
I think what I'm still struggling a little bit to understand is, you had this issue with options. You said, right, we're going to go for this new settlement approach, and the very first stage of that sort of journey was going to have this new settlement. It's going to be outside of the greenbelt. There wasn't then an option available for that new settlement outside of the greenbelt. That's what you said the previous answer. Okay, but then this option for a new settlement in the greenbelt did present itself. Okay, so council goes, well, okay, we'll consider this then. It's a new settlement is a meets that part of the strategy, notwithstanding the fact it's in the greenbelt. Okay, well, let's understand what potential impacts there may be. And I think the point that representatives say is that at that sort of fact-checking stage, consideration stage, okay, let's have a look at this option. It's in a parcel of land which, within our evidence, says it's going to cause very high, or indeed the impacts would be very high. So how then? I think what I'm sort of trying to understand, and perhaps be around the table, is how then? What was next? So you had that evidence. Okay, we can't have it outside the greenbelt. We've got an option in the greenbelt, but it's going to have a very high impact. So what did the council then do with that knowledge and that information?
I think so. Just to be clear from the start, though, we said there'd be a settlement and look for a new settlement outside the greenbelt. At the point of the SA, it was a new settlement in principle. Obviously, it was preferable outside the greenbelt, but the SA support supported a new settlement. Obviously, it was advantageous. It was better, as we've already said, outside the greenbelt. But that wasn't the presumption at that initial stage. It wasn't a bar on the being a new settlement. As you say, you look outside the new settlement, outside the greenbelt, with no sustainable options. we use the Greenbelt study to inform, and I think the answer to inform the consideration of the strategy, which is set out in the development strategy topic paper. And if you look at the development strategy topic paper for the draft local plan, CD 3.16, then that looks at the exceptional circumstances and concludes at that point that it could meet them. So that process was set out, was gone through, and formed part of the supporting documents to the plan at both draft and pre-submission stages.
So, Mr. Marlow, what was that reference again? The exceptional circumstances.
CD 3.16 is the development strategy topic paper supporting the draft local plan.
Okay, I don't know if people haven't spoken, but there's a gentleman at the back, yeah.
So you asked right at the beginning whether there were any other possibilities for the settlement that was not been in the Greenbelt, and of course there was a possibility of a settlement very close to two railway stations and existing settlements that might have formed the basis for a garden town. Probably the town board would have supported. But unfortunately, we became aware that the entire planning system conspires against what we would regard as rational decision making. No land other than a couple of fields were put up for under the call for sites, and therefore the Borough Council would have been faced either with a large compulsion purchase scheme until authority doesn't really have the staffing or financial resources, or it had to look elsewhere. We think that's most regrettable in the long term, but we do understand how the council found itself in the situation of not being able, in our view, to proceed with what would have been a very rational and new and expanded settlement in cooperation with two other neighbouring authorities, which might have had some bearing on the duty to cooperate as well. So really just a comment in sadness that the planning system to our mind is pretty well faithfully deployed.
Yeah, ladies.
I wanted to endorse much of what my colleagues were saying, and noting as well, the council is saying about high harm, Greenbelt, balanced decision, contribute to housing needs, relatively sustainable development. So it's not a ringing endorsement justified through the evidence. So I won't go into that in any more detail at the moment. But just harking back to what we were discussing yesterday and the reasons for pursuing a standalone development. And of course, going back to, I won't rehash this argument, but just put it on the table again. Going back to paragraph 11 of the NPPF, recognises that housing need requirement can be reduced. And that is, it has to be said that the council could consider reducing its housing requirement in acknowledgement of the great importance of the Greenbelt and the great weight to be attached to the AONB. And that's coming up again, that again through the Safe April letter from Department of Levelling Up, very recently published, it pretty much duplicates the letter that I attached to our original representations. The standard methods is the starting point, and it recognises that not everyone will be able to meet their housing needs in full. And that would be the position of CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity. There is plenty of justification for not needing tubing, because there is the capability to set a reduced housing requirement. One thing that we haven't discussed, and I know we will be discussing this at later dates, is looking at density. So all the other higher order settlements, the densities that have been used have been set at very low levels, and how much, with a bit of tweaking of density, soon eats into the number of dwellings that have been proposed at Jubilee. So as far as I can ascertain, the Sheila looked at a 30 dwelling per hectare density across the board. There's talk in the strategic sites master planning infrastructure document of this being 35 to 38. When we look at the National Design Code, those range of densities, well, they're very low. They are outer suburb range, suburban range. And if we're talking about a new settlement, a new urban settlement, we should be looking at higher densities. But that same thing should apply across the allocations that have already been established in higher order settlements. Have the council really explored that as an alternative to setting up a brand new development, a brand new settlement that quite frankly isn't sustainably located and would require people on a day-to-day basis to access a higher order settlements from Paddockwood and Tonbridge. And I don't think they're going to be able to do that through active travel or catching the bus.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bond. Thank you, sir.
Firstly, just wanted to endorse the point that Mr. Neal was making to you earlier, where the stage 1 and 2 greenbelt studies had identified a very high level of harm to the greenbelt, effect of Jubilee Village proposal. Then you heard Mr. Scully saying that the stage 1 and 2 greenbelt studies had provided a sufficient basis upon which to then inform the Regulation 19 strategy of going forward Jubilee Village. Yet at that time recognising that very high level of greenbelt harm. Just going back one step, there's a separate hierarchy and so forth. Again, there is the options at Royal Tunbridge Wells. And the council will tell you that those options, and in particular the areas to the north of the town, were rejected. Again, in relation to A and B and greenbelt terms. However, and this is a point I will come on to tomorrow when we talk about the greenbelt methodology and so forth. That judgment and conclusion that the council came to was based on a very high level assessment. There was no more finer grains, as I make in my position statement for this session. A more finer grain assessment of both the green belt and the A and B in respect of land broadly to the north of Royal Tunbridge Wells. And if there had been that finer grain assessment, I believe there would have been a legitimate, and I will come on to this tomorrow, and it does come to the point of soundness, there would have been a different conclusion through the various sustainability appraisal assessments that may not then have justified this new settlement, as opposed to, in response to your question, expansion to the town of Royal Tunbridge Wells. And I'll just flag up in terms of this, it's in the statement anyway, but St Albans District Council were heavily criticised by that examiner when looking at or the failure to have a more finer grained assessment to inform judgments and decisions on which areas of land were used.
Let's stay clear of the other examinations.
No, fair enough, sir, but it's the absence of that approach here which I feel has led to an incorrect strategy. I'll develop later, if not tomorrow.
Okay, you see, anything?
We're going to deal at some length tomorrow with the greenbelt assessments, which I think that will provide you with the information you need in order to assess the quality and extent of the evidence available to the council when it came to make this decision.
Okay, we'll move on. I said a lot of these topics will sort of progress, and we'll get into the detail of them as we go on with it. But I want to 20 minutes or so look at the Royal Tunbridge Wells in a little bit more detail, and again, without getting drawn into specifics of sites and just again taking sort of high level approach. I know that the sites are the submitted plan talks about Royal Tunbridge Wells surrounded by the AONB, except for areas to the west and north. I think it says. So the logical question there is, okay, so what options has the council therefore looked at for new development in these areas? We're talking about Royal Tunbridge Wells in areas adjacent to town, which do not fall within areas of the area.
I think I'll let Mr. Scully deal with this, but perhaps just by way of context, draw attention to the plan that's Appendix 2 of the council's hearing statement, which just shows the relationship of the built-up area of Tunbridge Wells with the AONB and Greenbelt, which I suppose to an extent is some to the south and some to the east as well. Yeah, Mr. Scully will can sort of advise in terms of the sort of detailed consideration that have been to those areas.
So this is contained in our issue 1 special strategy statement. Just for reference in terms of the actual question, paragraph 4.45 of the local plan, let's say mainly to the west and north. It was just a simple summary. The plan at Appendix 2, if you have it before you, shows the Greenbelt and the AONB boundaries, as well as the limits to build development. And you can see a number of gaps, if you like, between those designations. So I thought it would be useful just to explain what those are. At the south of the map, there's a rectangular area. That's actually the crematorium and cemetery, partly local wildlife science and a recreation area. Just to the sort of north, sort of directly east of or southeast of Royal Tunbridge Wells, there's a white area. That's actually a site that was allocated in the site allocations policy for 270 dwellings, I think, or thereabouts, and a primary school, and is virtually built out. Then to the east, you've got Pembury, and you can see there is a small gap between sort of Pembury, which isn't Greenbelt, which is AONB. That's the site known as Woodgate Corner. And then immediately sort of east of Tunbridge Wells, there's quite a large area, which is sort of green and brown. That was former rural fringe, and is a local wildlife site, area of ancient woodland, town green, but that's also incorporates now 500 plus dwellings and primary school as part of that development, again allocated through the site allocations policy. Go to the north, there's an area that's hatched just as AONB, but not Greenbelt. That's actually development as part of a industrial development, and is adjacent to the proposed large-scale employment allocation. Immediately sort of east of that, there's a pointed sort of rectangle, almost triangular. That's the former landfill site. And then if you go up to the north, you've got Bidborough, which is a small settlement, and Southborough. And then to the west of Tunbridge Wells, you have a white area. That's almost all entirely education. There's 4 secondary schools related to those land, and there's also council sports facilities as well. So that gives you the sort of context of the and then we've prepared for you a series of detailed plans in Appendix 1, which help understand the text and the table within the document. Obviously, you can read that for yourself, but if there's any questions, please ask. just in terms of going through very quickly each of those plans. So plan number 1 or area 1, you can see the on the right hand side there, the what is RTW 18, that's the allocation, that's actually for the landfill site. The land to the left, that contains a local nature reserve and an abattoir. Abattoirs are quite difficult to locate. You don't want to lose it. It's an important site, particularly in terms of the livestock within the high wheels. And to the west of that is ancient woodland and agricultural land. And to the north of the landfill site, you can see the reference to the Castle Hill option. So that's the location in relation to the Castle Hill scheme that's been discussed. On plan 2, area 2, to the north, we've got St Gregory's and Tunbridge Wells Forest Grammar, and they've got some sports facilities related in that area. Just to the right of where it says 2, we've got Tunbridge Wells Girls Grammar. They've got sports facilities within that area. We've also got the Reynolds Lane local wildlife sites, which is in the corner there. Then you've got a collection of sites in the middle. One's an allocation, that's for Tunbridge Wells 20, which is the former, or is the current stadium. There's a valley area there, which has got some woodlands and recycling. Has actually been consented to development in that area. I think it's about 7 units, 9 units. And then we come below that, and we've got Bennett Memorial School, and there's also a primary school at the southern end there. We come to area 3. You've got this is referred to as Canewood and Smockman Farm. We've heard references to that. As you can see, in the centre there, there's a large block of ancient woodland and local wildlife site. See at the top of the page there's 2 applications, SO1 and RTW5, and that's all mostly greenbelt, and beyond that, Area 4 is currently the Tunbridge Wells Golf Course, and there are to the east and west of it areas of common land, blocks of ancient woodland within adjacent, and that site is now proposed as a local green space, which will come on to. Area 5, you can see that encompasses areas of common land. As shown on here, there's also bits of conservation area, and we have an allocation within that land, RTW 14, which is the garden centre site. It's worth noticing because the next area just below this doesn't show the whole plan, but just to the south there, you can see that we're into what is wilderness district, and in the sort of top corner there, that's where High Rocks is, just to the sort of northwest of RTW 16, which is the scheduled ancient monument and visitor attraction. And if you look area 6, this is the allocation TW10, practical times. And is green belts, but outside the MOB, immediately to the south of that is Woodland District. And then area 7 is split into 2 bits between there. At the top, where it's got the historic park garden, it's really sort of jewel in the crown, as people refer to it, in terms of open spaces for Tunbridge Wells. And its particular characteristic is the views out from the park across the landscape, and which makes that area particularly sensitive. South of that, you've got the allocation RTW 19, which is the sports facilities. That's contained by ancient woodland to the east. Immediately south of that, you've got areas of woodland and local nature reserve, local wildlife site, and the site reference 255 is the development I previously referred to. That was allocated in the south, was almost built out, 270 plus houses in primary school. And in area 8, Roman numerals, this is encompasses land that includes representations by people around the table, particularly site 114 and 99. And you can see there's the land to the north is ancient woodland. A large part of that is managed by the RSPB. To the northeast, to the northwest, it connects to the woodland associated with the previous south site. Within that area, you can see there's also the hospital to the northeast, and also just to the northeast of the A25P, as Alfnest Wood, which has been allocated and has a consent for development.
So, without getting, as I said, on day one, really, drawn into discussing commission sites and sites that aren't within the plan. But for the purpose of this question, considering the strategy, then that's obviously demonstrated that there have been sites put to the council around the edge of the principal town, which are in some cases, yes, in the green belt, but outside of the A1B. So in that context, representatives will sort of argue that that's the same as, say, the Tudor Village in the green belt, outside of the edge of the A1B. So why? The question for me really at this stage of the strategy is, what were the reasons for the council not seeking to, at the sort of strategic level, redraw the green belt boundary around its principal town, as opposed to redrawing the boundary for a new settlement at Tudor Village?
So I'm not sure it's a binary choice, and there is, you've seen the general constraints around the town have been assessed. It's not just A and B and green belt, there's all the other considerations, heritage considerations, particularly, and topography and so on. So there's a number of issues to be factored in to that kind of approach. And you've also seen the sort of scale of developments being ongoing as well. So there's the way that's being managed. But those sites that have been submitted have been considered through the process, Sheila and so on, and been informed by the stage 2 green belt assessment. Don't know if you want to say any more on that stage in terms of the choices made. I suppose when you make that strategically, there's a choice there, making change.
I think the key thing is, Scully says, all the sites were looked at on a like-for-like basis. So the benefits of developing around Royal Tunbridge Wells in terms of access to services and facilities were factored into the consideration. Indeed, as has been pointed out, you have a number of greenbelt releases. It wasn't that it's greenbelt around Tunbridge Wells, it won't go, those sites where it was justified, and obviously maybe objectors to those, they are put forward. So in essence, there are a number of factors in relation to Tunbridge Wells that all played into the assessment, and we refer to that in the sort of background paper as well. So air quality comes to mind as well in some cases.
So is this a case of considering the sites available and put to you, and considering those almost sort of like on their own merits, and there was no sort of prejudged, predetermined, we're only going to have so much growth in some controls because we want to pursue new settlement large scale multi-site work.
No, absolutely not. No, there's no preconception. I'm absolutely certain of that. You know, the sites around Tunbridge Wells, as you know, we said, you know, we looked at, and you can see this in relation to the Sheila sites that came in. We were asked to look at a number, and we looked at all around the town. So it was a question of, as you know, as I've said, a like for like comparison. There was no predetermination of how much should go where, but clearly there are benefits. Fully recognise that in terms of access to services and facilities and a host of things at Tunbridge Wells, at Royal Tunbridge Wells.
Okay, comments on that? Drag into emission sites and council's judgment, so you've got the representation.
So just, I hope it's helpful. I did an analysis of the Tunbridge Wells Sheila sites, suitable and available, and it came out with 2,620 units, which on the submission plan was only 1,476. So in direct comparison of suitable Sheila sites, suitable and available, there was quite a considerable capacity difference there. And there were also additional sites which were identified for leisure and employment, about 1,600, which wouldn't necessarily come through as employment, quickly changing values. I didn't hear any of that, so it was really an assessment. I would have thought Sheila assessments were probably a good starting point.
Okay, so we've heard a lot this morning around see some of the reasons why sorry,
just very shortly, and keeping out of the sites, on this question 6, to which we responded, we say, and without repeating the submissions that Mr. Meir and others made, and having heard the council's arguments, there hasn't been a rational or sound approach to deciding whether land to be taken out of the green belt and then assessing it by virtue of sustainability issues, particularly if one looks at Royal Tunbridge Wells. So we can find no rational sound approach that's been carried out in a clear and systematic way, which answers the questions that you've posed. I mean, we have a citing question, I won't say anything about it, but that has not been, there's no evidence that we can find, come on to Greenbelt later, that there has been a systematic, high level and rational approach, which is sound.
Questions 7 and 8 really, similar questions we've been doing together, but we have discussed this to some degree already and touched upon this. And this is the issue of, we started talking about the constraints, we talked about the constraints around Royal Tunbridge Wells, we've talked about new settlement opportunity, location with Greenbelt. So the ultimate question is, at a strategic level, could the council meet its housing and employment needs without releasing land in the Greenbelt or requiring development in the AONB? Essentially, could you meet these needs in these unconstrained locations? And is the answer to that, well, potentially yes, you could, but it's about sustainable patterns of development. It's about, we know that Tunbridge Wells is open to town. It's about, we know these other locations, Canewood, for example, and is it the council's position that actually to meet needs elsewhere, then you'd be going into quite significantly smaller settlements, rural areas, etc., without transport accessibility, jobs, etc., etc. I think it was a question I posed at Matt's 1.
Got nothing to add to your answer there.
So that's the reason then, could have done, potentially, but it's about land availability. It's also about sustainable parties of development. So ultimately, there has to be that balance trade-off between meeting housing needs and releasing land from the green belt, be that Morrison Ridge Wells, New Settlement, Canewood, etc. etc. Will people generally agree or disagree with that? People think that housing needs could actually be met elsewhere altogether without the creative degree belt. Gentleman at the back of the class is not can you?
Thank you. John Dunbridge Wells Green Party. Firstly, apologies, my hearing statement was only uploaded on Monday, so maybe not everybody has read it. But it's from Forton Goodbridge between yesterday's dispatch high numbers and tomorrow on green belt release. Because the main points were made was when stage when the council saw that the application of those numbers was going to maintain so much green belt, wherever it might be, it should have gone back and taken a number of actions, including authorities to find a way to avoid it. And then it made things worse by adding in a buffer of 1,050. And in the hearing statement, which is on the website, I've listed several of the words, in our opinion, green belt sites in Tunbridge Wells, such as Spatial Farm, the Garden Centre, Canewood Farm, and also the word affected areas of Canewood and better Benetton on the edge of the ANOB. Those sites could have been taken right out of the equation if the numbers had been reduced. Finally, when we get to the council meeting on the 3rd of February 21, in the briefing papers, there was reference to a quite important statement made by the Housing Minister, then Robert Jenrick, on the 16th of December. But the briefing paper only said that his statement referred to mainly cities, when in fact Robert Jenrick defined, as we heard earlier, that the standard method establishes a starting point, not a target, and it's left up to local authorities to determine the number of houses within their constraints, and particularly the green belt, but also other NBBF safeguards on the ALNB, but that wasn't done. And the fact that that statement was not included in the briefing of the council gives me the idea that actually the councillors were not fully informed when they approved the local plan going on to this inspection. The numbers are too high and a lot of damage could have been avoided by reducing the numbers within the guidelines which the minister has issued. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ladies, you're right.
I just want to endorse exactly what John said there, and just to reiterate the point about densities across other sites that have already been allocated, that they could take the higher yield on those sites in more higher ordered settlements in order that the green belt and OMB weren't pushed under the bus, so to speak.
Yeah, gentlemen, you're on.
Thank you, sir. My colleague Michael Lees would like to interview on this one. If that's okay.
I'm going to pick up essentially on 2 points that the two speakers just now, with this question of whether or not housing needs will be met outside of or avoiding the green belt and the ALNB. And I want to say that in the town forum's position, we believe that to be the case, because we think that development should generally be met within the settlement pattern and communication patterns that we already have.
This might sometimes necessarily include some minor adjustments to green belts and AONB, but generally that principle should stand. The reasons for this boil down to the correlation between housing density and intensity. And the fact that suburban housing typically is far too thin in its density and its intensity to allow convenient communities. Consequence of low density and intensity is that residents faced with amenities at an inconvenient distance all too often have to reach their car keys. To go to the shops, visit surgeries, visit health, to go to the gym, to get the kids, bring the kids, etc. Now, all of that might have seemed fine, say, back in 1952, but it doesn't seem fine now, because in 1952, we didn't really experience clogged roads, and we had decent transport systems and buses and trains. And we didn't think about the idea of fouling the air with our car engines. And we didn't think also about the way that all of that was warming the planet, but we know about that now. And we have to start to think differently. This need also to act differently. So the town forum advocates change, and we want to see it starting in our local planning. We want to see densification and intensification of our existing settlements, such that our population will increase, and in doing so, will improve the quality, the range, and the convenience of our communities. Because we have a planning system which mainly considers sites which are offered, and compulsory purchase doesn't really figure these days, we have a situation in which the right planning and site allocation have to be a different kind of local political task supported by the local plan. It becomes one of coaxing and assembling development opportunities. Now, where site values are relatively higher with higher density and intensity, this should be an easier task. But it's a big task and it needs leadership and creativity. So we at the Town Forum advocate that we need to get on with this. And we're saying that we won't start in Tonbridge Wells unless we work on further on the plan that we're talking about here. Someone on the other side of the table yesterday, for very different reasons, asked that the inspector should recognise certain inconsistencies and call for further work on the plan. And I think his words were something along the lines of, please set a signal. We at the forum, the Town Forum, are asking for the same. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate we'll come on to extra care in matter 8, but just in the context of this question, should housing needs be met by requiring land not in the AONB? And to that question in relation to extra care, we think yes. That there are sites that are not within the AONB that could be allocated to meet the extra care need that's been identified. And when looking at extra care, it's not just the need, but it's obviously the type. And in this borough, there are a number of extra care facilities that are on busy main road frontages. And not everybody that needs an extra care facility wants to live in the middle of town on a busy extra care, on a busy road frontage. So it's looking at, in our view, looking at sites that are outside the AONB, on the edge of town, which are in the green belt, that could be released to meet extra care needs. Thank you.
Gentleman back.
Yeah, so just a short point just to draw your attention, if it hasn't already been drawn in previous sessions. I think a very helpful illustration of this is on figure 3 in the local plan, page 22. which just illustrates the scale of the issue that Tunbridge Wells had to face here. It's a plan that very clearly shows just how much of the borough is covered either by Greenbelt or AONB or both. And it also very clearly illustrates that the areas that don't fall into one of those two categories, primarily the only settlement of any significant size that has a lot of land around it that doesn't fall into either category, Paddock Wood, and we know that the council are looking at a lot of development of Paddock Wood, quite appropriately. But clearly, if the council is going to meet its housing needs properly, which I'm pleased to see that it is a council that is trying to do that, then it is clear that some other compromises are going to have to be made in terms of Greenbelt and AONB to look at things sustainably.
So just very briefly, you asked about whether housing needs cannot be met in these areas. It's clear and Safe Capable accepts that the borough is extremely constrained. We've seen by Mr. Scully's very detailed exposition going around the town, and anyone familiar with Tunbridge Wells can take issue with his analysis. But that goes to our point. I just want to keep laying the market down. The nature of the heavily constrained borough and the number of constraints which we see makes it all the more important that at the earliest possible stage, the borough should have been going to other neighbouring authorities and trying to work out a joint approach. And I'm not going to repeat what we said in relation to duty to cooperate, because you have all of that already. But we just want to say that this all goes to show why our submissions in respect of duty to cooperate are correct, and that the stage at which that engagement happened was far too late in the process. It's obvious to anyone with any familiarity with the borough to know that they would butt up against these constraints and that they couldn't meet all their needs in their own area at the very outset. But you have my points on that, so I just wanted to make sure that they're acknowledged in respect to question 7. Thank you.
Can I want to say anything just on what you said? No. Question 9 is a repeat of the question yesterday, and it was clear there purposely because we made representations under the strategy around this issue, and others have made the points under the housing numbers. We did have the discussion yesterday, but I will open it up for those who weren't here yesterday. Essentially, the question is, do policies related to the Greenbelt, the AONB and flood risk as well, do they provide a strong reason for restricting the size, the scale, type and distribution of Tunbridge developments? And that goes back to the question yesterday about, we know about these constraints, we know about these issues. Is that a reason for restricting? Is that a reason for limiting? Also, we heard yesterday around, what the framework says, framework allows for, we heard from various people yesterday about how it allows the development in the Greenbelt, removing Greenbelt boundaries, changing Greenbelt boundaries there, etc. But I know that people were here yesterday. If they want to make any comments, I think the CPR, I think that was the point you were making earlier, wasn't it? Is that actually, in your view, yes, these constraints are such they should limit growth. And should that be, in your view, then, if the council can't point to locations beyond the AONB and beyond the Greenbelt because you feed into very small settlements where the council doesn't want to sort of push significant growth? So in your view then, is the answer to that, well, you can't meet housing needs? Or is it, should we actually know, should be meeting housing needs, and actually these rural areas, small settlements should be refocused?
So CPRE aren't anti-housing, but all about the right housing in the right places. And it's a difficult decision that needs to be made. But I will just draw you back to paragraph 11 that does allow the council to put forward their housing requirement that is lower than their housing need. So I would say, yes, if the densities can't be increased, I said that can't be put by the town forum, that the requirement should be reduced. And I think perhaps what's coming out for me is that there is a lot of greenbelt, there is a lot of A and B in the borough, and it's almost like, you know, the council's becoming blinded to that. It's just the norm, and it is a special thing that needs to be protected. That's why the government attaches great importance to greenbelt, and a great weight should be given to conserving enhancing the A and B. And we look at the response to the government's response to the Glover report in the context of, you know, lockdown and our need to either be in the open air, the countryside, and the importance that's having for our well-being, you know, our health and well-being has been recognised at government level throughout the last 2 years. So I would say, yes, I'm on the side of the countryside, and I think that the requirements should be reduced.
Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, sir. Diagram 2 in the PPG is called application of the sequential test for the local plan preparation in relation to flood risk. And we still haven't heard from the council in terms of how that diagram is actually applied to their decision-making, consideration of spatial strategy, etc. Even though their own SFRA number one recommendation in that from consultants is we need to do a sequential test following that process that's set out. And that process starts with, can development be allocated in flood zone 1? And if it can, then the sequential test is passed. I don't see anywhere in the council's evidence where they've gone through that process and saying, can the development be met on flood zone 1 in the borough? And then there's a number of other stages that if you don't pass that test, then you have to move on to, can development be allocated in flood zone 2? Allocate sites but not apply exception test is highly more important. And there's a number of stages here that you need to go through in terms of the sequential test for flood risk. And I don't see that anywhere in the council's evidence base.
Okay, well what we'll do, we'll jump forward slightly because we'll take this issue now. We'll discuss this now because it'll probably then lead us quite nicely to a lunch break. The question means jumping forward slightly to the second issue in question 7, which is where I asked about how fully constraints can be taken into account in determining the spatial distribution. And ultimately, is the plan consistent with the framework in that. So in terms of the risk-based approach to the location of developments, how did the council take that into account in the site allocation process? Was it again screening out sites at a high level that were flood zones 2 and 3, or was it looking at them in greater detail? How did you approach the issue of flooding constraint? We've heard a lot about A and B's and greenbelts. How did you approach the flooding constraint?
So if I could turn to your question 7 in the later issue, which is page 25 of 42 of the council's statement. I think that probably the first point to make, to draw attention to is paragraph 86 of that. Sets out the MPPF, paragraph 162, aims to steer development to areas of lowest flood risk. But then paragraph 163 is clear that dependence on the vulnerability of development, that if it is in a particular vulnerability category, it can still be appropriate in flood zone 2 as well. And I'll come back to the point of that subsequently. So then, sir, to answer your question about how it was taken into account, that's just, if you like, paragraphs 91 through to 100 in terms of the sustainability appraisal. So how the level 1 strategic flood risk assessment informed the sustainability appraisal, and it then goes on to how that informed the Sheila, the assessment of the individual sites. So it was a very rigorous, robust level 1 assessment. It took account of all sources of flooding in accordance with the PPF. It also had a cautionary approach in relation to climate change. So paragraph 95 sets that out as a higher climate change allowance than required by the latest guidance. So that then directly was taken into account in the SA and in the Sheila through the process set out in those paragraphs. And ultimately, to take it sort of one step further in terms of the sequential test, and this is why I drew the attention to paragraph 86. All of the developments ultimately in the pre-submission local plan is in flood zone 1, or where there is a relatively small amount in flood zone 2 at Canewood, the vulnerability of those uses, essentially housing, is appropriate in flood zone 2. So perhaps it's jumping ahead, but the council's conclusions are that the sequential test has been passed. The response also explains why the exception test was taken at draft local plan stage as well, and that's because there was it was only through the further work undertaken at draft local plan stage that it could be demonstrated that housing could be provided primarily at Canewood in flood zone 1, with a small amount in flood zone 2, with none in flood zone 3. But because we hadn't got to that, we hadn't got that evidence at that point, the exception test was undertaken at the draft local plan stage.
Practice guidance provides further information on the aims of the sequential test. I think Mr. Hayes is making. It says, what is the aim of the sequential test for the location development? Sequential test ensures that sequential approaches follow to steer new development to areas with the lowest probability of flooding. Flood zones as defined in the strategic flood assessment of the area provide the basis for applying the test. The aim is to steer new developments for the zone 1, areas with a low probability of flooding. Where there are no reasonably available sites in flood zone 1, local planning authorities in their decision making should take into account flood risk, vulnerability, and land uses and consider reasonably available sites in flood zone 2. So the point Mr. Hayes is making is that to apply the sequential test, would it be are there any reasonably available sites in flood zone 1 to meet those housing needs? So at that stage, obviously you jumped ahead to start considering vulnerability of uses, etc. But in Mr. Hayes' submission, should that site be one of the tops around Canewood, should that have even passed that sort of sieving or filtering exercise? Should it even have got past, very first initial question, are there any reasonably available sites in flood zone 1? Now we know that there's a buffer in the plan. So is the answer to that question not, well, there's a buffer in the plan, its housing needs would still be met? So Mr. Hayes' submission is that the site shouldn't have been allocated on that basis, should have failed at that sort of very first hurdle at that strategic level. I think Mr. Hayes, is that the point you make?
Absolutely. And I know that further evidence has been prepared through the sort of master planning process, but the point is that we're not following what PPG is telling you to do, which is the first stage in the process is, can you direct development, potential development away from the areas of highest risk and direct them towards areas of lowest risk, particularly flood zone areas 1. So it's really clear in the SFRA level 1 assessment that was done as well. It says at 13.2, the SFRA has not performed a sequential test of potential development sites, and it's really left to the council to do that work itself, presumably, because it wasn't done by the consultants. So there's no piece of evidence anywhere that sort of sets out how they followed that important sequential test, which is laid out really clearly in the PVG diagram 2. So how can you move forward in terms of the further stages of that diagram, that flow chart, without having, first of all, can all the development be located within zone 1?
Yes, are you referring to the flow chart in the PVGs that are in the plan making?
Yes. Application of the sequential test for local plan preparation.
Yeah, diagram 2 in PVG. Essentially, yeah. So it's diagram 2, kind of got to be allocated in zone 1. And then, yes, when it's passed load, etc.
I think in the SFRA as well, it says that the majority of the sites that they looked at, consultants looked at, were in flood zone 1. I think it was something nearly 500 sites that were looked at or put forward in the Shillong. So why is it that the council has decided to put the majority of its growth within an area that's partially covered by zones 2 and 3?
I think so. One of the important aspects to remember and relate, because we're talking here specifically about the site to the west of Paddock Wood in East Canewood. It is not the case at all that land that is entirely flood zone 2. In fact, there are considerable areas of that land which are in flood zone 1. And the council, when considering that, considering the options, considering the growth, the strategy, as has been explained earlier, and the processes it went through, it was aware that there are some areas of flood zone 2 within those broader parcels, but equally there are significant areas of flood zone 1, and therefore it wasn't a case that those parcels, those larger parcels, should be ruled out immediately at that first sifting stage, because there's potential, there's sizable areas of those larger parcels being in flood zone 1, and the council has a good understanding of the flooding situation in Paddock Wood. The SFRA was very clear. It had undertaken detailed inputs to the level 1 SFRA, included extensive modelling. It was undertaken by JBA, who have expert consultants who have a very big knowledge of Paddock Wood. And so the council's view is that it should not have sifted out west of Paddock Wood at that stage. Yes, there are areas of flood zone 2, there are areas of flood zone 3, but there are equally sizable areas of flood zone 1. And when we come back to the wider sustainability matters that were considered, including, as Mr. Marlowe explained earlier, in relation to how Paddock Wood was formed part of the strategy as a sizable area of growth.
So within that, we obviously we're going to discuss this in great detail more actually this allocation, but within that allocation, is the allocation dependent upon development, residential development within flood zones, outside flood zone 1, essentially?
No.
Does any residential development proposed in areas flood zones 2 and 3.
The structure plan assumes not. Through detailed pre-application discussions, it might be that very few, so we're talking about a handful out of the 3,500 may be in flood zone 2. Now the allocation is not dependent on those very few houses coming forward, and that's not been agreed yet by the council or the through developers discussions, but if that was the case, then it would be considered in line with the relevant policies as established through the NPPF. But no, the allocation is not dependent on delivery within flood zone 2. And so the sequential approach through the master planning work has been met, and that's how the number has been arrived at in our local plan.
Okay, Sage, want to?
Yeah, I mean, Appendix D of the SFRA, which is the climate change flood zone 3A. I mean, just 3, I don't know if you can see it from there, but it's quite extensive, and that's flood zone 3. So I think it suggests that there's no impact in terms of the development being proposed at Canewood in zone 2. I think we need to be looking carefully at that mapping that was undertaken by the council's own consultants, looking at those areas in much greater detail. It's not just about, are we right within this, within the boundary of that flood risk zone. It's the cumulative impact of putting thousands of houses and jobs in this location. Because I think we've already heard that the council does consider that that's going to increase the overall flood risk for the area. And that the only way for this to work is for the existing flood risk to be mitigated, resolved, before then applying more development to that area. But it still doesn't follow in terms of looking at all of zone 1 in the borough first, if you're going to use PPG.
Okay, Mr. Hugh.
So I'll pass you over, if I may, to Mr. Gledhill, just to address in some points of detail in relation to flooding. But we entirely endorse what's been said by Mr. Hayes on behalf of the Canewood Town Council. And I would say just to re-emphasise the point that Mr. Hayes has made, just ask you to look very carefully at what I would submit is entirely garbled reasoning in paragraph 87 of the council's position statement, one of the paragraphs that Mr. Vaughan took you to. That states that at this introductory stage, the council considers that the sequential test has been met in the submission local plan due to the manner in which the spatial strategy developed. It also undertook work ahead of the local plan to allow the exception test to be undertaken. So reading that, one would understand that goes to the point Mr. Hayes made, that the council is saying actually the SFRA and all of that work has nothing to do with the sequential test. But then if you carry on reading that paragraph, it says, as it was not clear at the time, and it was not until the completion of the master planning work for the strategic side, whether the sequential test would be met. And it just doesn't make much sense. Council seems to be saying, oh, well, we were okay with the sequential test because we looked at that through our policy choices in the development plan. But then we also looked at the exception test, carried out some master planning work, and then considered the sequential test would be met. It just doesn't make any sense. And it does suggest that there's been a stage in decision-making process that's been overlooked here. And well, I just like to sort of re-emphasize, we don't really understand what paragraph 87 is really saying. But if I just land, there's a couple of further points we were going to make in terms of the SFRA, which, if I may, I'll allow Mr. Gledhill to address you.
Thank you, sir. Just picking up on Mr. Hayes' comments about the sequential test and the SFRA prepared back in 2019. And I think in the context of whether a sequential approach has been taken by the council, can be identified as not so. The council has focused the majority of its planned housing on or adjacent to the largest areas of flood risk. So that in itself is is rather odd. But when one talks about the SFRA, it did not go to a level 2 for the Chewview site. It recognised the flood zone immediately, literally building up to the border of the flood zone to the north. But the SFRA did recognise existing risk from reservoir flooding and also surface water, high risk existing flooding. So on the scale of 2,800 houses with a potential runoff, not only are we concerned within Canewood, but the same concerns have been expressed by Tunbridge and Morning Borough Council, who also have those serious concerns outstanding, as we've heard at matter 1. Then we can turn to the exception test, and it seems to me that the council are trying to justify building in areas of flood zones to improve the flood risk elsewhere. And I think this point is, we did